Hey everyone, and welcome back to Online Latin. Today we're going to be talking about a few different things. We'll be discussing two irregular verbs, Ferō and Volō, and then some variations off of Volō. We're going to be talking about some different kinds of clauses, Proviso clauses and cum clauses, and we'll be talking about conditional sentences, and we're going to do it all in that order. So let's go ahead and get started. We've got some verbs here, Ferō and Volō. These verbs are irregular, and you'll notice when you look at the forms, here is Ferō, here are the four principal parts. So it begins with Ferō, the infinitive then is Ferē, the third principal part is Tuli, so you can see a very big difference here, and then the fourth principal part is Latum. Now, you can already see some irregularity in the infinitive, but if you notice Tuli and Latum, these look like different words altogether, and that's partly because, well, originally they were. Tuli is probably from the word tatuli, and Latum from tlatum, and these words have been brought together, and these particular usages kind of were used, and they end up kind of meaning the same thing. To bear or carry. And remember, when this happens, when you have two or more words kind of come together to function in different tenses, we've got a word for this. It's called suppletion. And that's what seems to be going on here. This word is irregular. It's not the only one that we're talking about today. The other one is Volō. And you can see the irregularity in the infinitive here, vele. And even more so when you look at the perfect forms, because volui is the third principal part, but the fourth principal part doesn't exist because there are no passive forms for this verb. And this verb means to wish. So, where these verbs are irregular, for Ferō, you're looking at an irregularity in the present, indicative, imperative, and infinitive. Those are the places that you're going to see irregularity. In Volō, or Volō, depending on how you want to pronounce it, you're going to see some irregularity here. No future active infinitive or participle, so no future active infinitive or future active participle. No imperatives. One of the variations on Volō that we're going to talk about in a moment will have an imperative, but Volō has no imperatives. And then the present indicative and the subjunctive have these different stems here. So the present indicative has the stem vol, and the subjunctive operates with the stem vel. Okay, so what you have to do is you really just have to memorize the irregular forms for these verbs. It's the only way to do it, and you can see them in the Wheelock book. And you'll also note that the subjunctive of Volō also is going to resemble the subjunctive of sum, so the to be verb. So pay attention to that, memorize the forms. Volō has a couple of variations here. And again, Volō means to wish. And the variations that come out of Volō are one, nolo, and that's nolo, nole, no Louis, and again looks a lot like Volō, doesn't it? As well as malo, and again looks a lot like Volō. Now, part of the reason for that is that these really just are compound words. Nolo comes from ne, which you know is a negation word, and you add that really to the beginning of Volō, and you end up with nolo. And so, whereas Volō means to wish, when you add ne to the beginning, it means to not wish, or even to be unwilling. It's kind of the same thing, but maybe a little bit different here. Malo also is formed by putting a word together with Volō, and it's with magis plus Volō. And this is to want something more or to prefer. Okay, so you need to memorize the irregular forms, and these forms are irregular in similar places as Volō, but the nolo forms are odd as they also reveal the kind of the synthetic nature of the verb, and you can see that as you memorize the forms. And you can see those again in your Wheelock book as they're kind of taken apart. You can see how it's some forms that taking the two words and putting them together is obvious because it's parsed then sometimes with using two words. So one other place that nolo kind of goes in a different direction than Volō is that it has singular and plural imperatives. And this is important because when you add this nolo imperative, noli, or nolite in the plural, and you add a complementary infinitive, then that's one way to express a negative command. It's something like, you do not wish to, or you do not want to. That's really how it would sound in English. You do not want to do this. We kind of use this construction in English. You might say, don't do this, or you really don't want to do that. And so an example of that would be something like, O mulier, nolite timere. A woman, you do not wish to be afraid, or just don't be afraid. You don't want to be afraid. These are some examples then of, again, Ferō and Volō, and then some variations on Volō. You're going to want to memorize these forms, but also remember where they go irregular in the first place. The next thing I want to talk about then is a certain kind of a clause, and we're going to talk about a couple of different kinds of clauses. First, we're going to start with something short. We're going to talk about proviso clauses and then cum clauses. So let's go ahead and jump in talking about proviso clauses. Now, proviso clauses indicate a provisional circumstance, and you can tell this by the name. And there's an introductory word that's used here for these clauses, dumodo, and this is a compound. It comes from dum plus modo, and dum is like while or as long as, and modo is, now or just now, and this isn't, we're using the adverb form here, or only. And so one of these proviso clauses, then you use dum modo, but then you use a subjunctive verb. Another way to do it, to negate it then, would be something like dum modo, and then you add ne in your subjunctive verb. And the way to translate these then are, dum modo really means so long as, or to use the terminology of the name of the clause, provided that, right? Like a provision. And so the negation is so long as, or provided that, something not happen. And an example then would be populus felix erit dum modo dominus veniat. Populus felix erit dum modo dominus veniat. And so that would be the people will be happy, populus felix erit, dum modo, so long as dominus veniat, the Lord comes. And so you see that we actually translate veniat, even though this is a subjunctive, you translate it like an indicative. The people will be happy so long as the Lord comes. So it's one kind of a clause that I want to introduce to you, and that you can find in your Wheelock book. Another kind of a clause, and this has got several layers to it, is something called a cum clause. And we're going to be talking about several different kinds of cum clauses. The first cum clause that I want to talk about is called a cum temporal clause. And the way that this clause operates is that you end up with your cum clause that has cum with an indicative verb, and then it goes on. And so you end up with your cum clause at the beginning, and then it goes on to your main clause. And the way that you would translate that is when or while, either one of those would work. Another way to do it is you could add tum to the main clause. So you have cum plus your indicative verb, and then your main clause would begin with tum. And the way that you would translate this combination is something like not only, and then you would have but also, and that's the tum part there, not only but also. Now, these clauses, they're called cum clauses. These temporal clauses, they could begin with cum, when, or even after, but you could begin one of these clauses with, say, ubi or ut. And the meaning is going to be similar, kind of when, temporal. With ubi, you could also be dealing with, as soon as, or again, ut, when, or just as. So an example might be cum, and you could again put ubi or ut in here. Jesus surrexit apostoli erant laeti. And that would be when Jesus arose, the apostles were joyful. When Jesus arose, the apostles were joyful. And this is an adverbial clause. It's, when this happens, then this happens. Cum clauses can be indicative, as we've got here. That's what this is. This is an indicative. But they can also be subjunctive. And as a subjunctive clause, we've got, a few more options here. So the first one I want to talk about is called the cum circumstantial clause. And this really just describes the general circumstances in which the main clause is occurring. So it's simple. Your cum clause is just cum with the subjunctive verb now, and then you have your main clause. And the way that you translate that is when, very similar to what we saw above. So an example would be cum Jesus turbam doceret. So now we're dealing with a subjunctive, that imperfect subjunctive. Quidam acessit. And that would be something like, when Jesus was teaching the crowd, a certain man approached him. Now, you could just translate it as when, and it would sound a lot like a cum temporal clause. And notice it does sound indicative. You're just translating it as an indicative. But you could also give a little bit more meaning here if you recognize it as a cum circumstantial clause. You could say something like, under the circumstances when Jesus was teaching the crowd, a certain man approached him. So again, it's subjunctive, but you translate it as an indicative. Another variation on this would be what we call a cum causal clause. And this is different from the cum circumstantial clause. And that whereas the cum circumstantial clause describes the general circumstances in which the main clause occurs, the cum causal clause gives the cause of the main clause. So it looks similar, though. You have cum plus your subjunctive verb, and then your main clause. But the difference is in the way that you're going to translate it. You might translate it here as since, instead of when or under the circumstances. Now it's since this, then this. So an example would be cum vir esset Felix. Notice again the subjunctive here, prae gaudio clamavit. Since the man was happy, he shouted for joy. Now, I suppose you could, you might say, well, how do I know not to translate this a different way? You could say, well, what's stopping this from being a cum circumstantial clause? Under the circumstances, when the man was happy, he shouted for joy. Well, that would work too. But here you can kind of pick up from the context that his happiness is what's guiding him or leading him or causing him to shout for joy. If you miss that, sometimes it'll be a little ambiguous or seemingly arbitrary, which is fine. That there's ambiguity in language. But when you can pick up on it that this is the cause of the main clause, then we would call that a causal clause. The next one then, and the last one really, is kind of the opposite. This is called the cum adversative, or maybe better known as a concessive clause. And this describes circumstances potentially opposed to the main clause, which is interesting because it's difficult then to differentiate between this and the cum circumstantial, the circumstances that give rise to it versus the circumstances that are opposed to it. And the way that this looks is it's just a cum with a subjunctive verb, and the way that you would translate this is not, when or since, or under the circumstances of or something, but rather although, which might seem odd. It might seem like an odd use of cum, but it's although. Another way to make this a little bit more complex and maybe even more obvious that it's different would be not only having cum with your subjunctive verb in your cum clause, but then also beginning your main clause with tamen. And the way that's going to look is something like, although this happened, nevertheless, this happens. Something like that. So it's a little bit more obvious that they're different than the cum circumstantial or the cum causal. And an example of this would be cum viri male haberent. So again, your subjunctive there, laborare, optional tamen, non desierunt. And that would be translated as, although the men were sick. Habeo male is an idiom that means to be sick. So, although the men were sick, nevertheless, and that's the tama, nevertheless, they did not stop working. And so these are your examples then of your cum clauses, your cum circumstantial, your cum causal, and your cum adversative or cum concessive. And again, these are all adverbial clauses as they set up the situation really for the main clause. They are talking about the situation which gives rise to the main clause, even if it's contrary to it. The next thing I want to talk about then is conditional sentences. And this is the last thing that we're going to talk about today. Conditional sentences are a little bit more complex than the ones that we were just talking about, the proviso or cum clauses, because what we're dealing with is two clauses in conjunction with each other with very specific things going on in each of the clauses. There is some more variety here, and this is very important. The way that we talk about subjunctive and indicative, you can see how mood is really, really important in Latin. Mood means a whole lot in Latin. So the way that you arrange the subjunctive and indicative with each other is going to alter the meaning a little bit. We even saw that a little bit with the cum clauses. So these sentences come in two parts. The first part is a conditional clause. The second part is the conclusion or result clause. This first clause, this conditional clause, is called the protasis. And this is really important because this is Greek for premise. That's what this means. This is the premise of the whole conditional sentence. This is also a subordinate clause. This is not the main clause. And this subordinate clause is usually introduced with the word si, and this means if. Here's the condition, or here's the premise. If this, if you want to negate it, it's usually nisi, and that's going to mean if not, or could also mean unless. This protasis sets up a hypothetical circumstance, and then it's up to the conclusion or result clause, aka the apodosis, which is Greek word for result, to tell us what the outcome is. And this is going to be the main clause. This is your main clause, the apodosis. The second clause here states the outcome. It's whether or not the premise, the protasis, turns out to be true. When you have these two together, this is really just one big compound result clause. That's really what this is. Indicatives tend to be used in these clauses when the clauses seem more likely to come true. So we use indicatives when we're dealing with potential facts. And I'm going to show you in a second how there is a set of kind of indicative conditions and subjunctive conditions. So we're going to go through them and you'll see all of them play out. Subjunctives, these are used when there is less likelihood of it working out, or if the condition and results are known to be contrary to reality. It could be an ideal, positive or negative. And the way that it looks is you end up with then, if this, and this is your protasis, then this, your apodosis, right? So again, some kind of like compound result clause, but really just one big if-then statement. So we'll go ahead and we'll do several of them. We're going to walk through, there's three indicative conditions and then three subjunctive conditions. And the first one that I want to do is in the indicative conditions is called the simple fact present. And the simple fact present is very simple. You have in your protasis a present indicative verb, and then in your apodosis another present indicative. And that's it. And the way that you translate these then is you translate if this happens, then this happens. Very simple. And I'll give you examples here in a minute once I go through them all. The next one then is your simple fact past. And like the simple fact present, it's pretty simple. You end up with a past tense indicative and the apodosis, another past tense indicative. This would be like a perfect or an imperfect, either one. And the way that you translate this is if this happened, then this happened. Or if this was happening, then this was happening. The last one then, for the indicative conditions, is the simple fact future. So we have the simple fact present, the simple fact past, and the simple fact future. And this one has another name to it. It's usually called the future more vivid. You'll see why in a second here. The way this one works is you end up with a future indicative in your protasis and a future indicative in your apodosis. Now, there is some possibility of having something else here. You could, for the apodosis, actually have a jussive subjunctive. It's a little more rare. And the way that it translates then is if this happens, then they will do that. That first if, though, it sounds present, but it's present with kind of a future sense to it. So it's like, if this happens in the future, then this will happen in the future. So those are your indicatives. I'm going to go through the subjunctives then. And once I go through the subjunctives, and you're going to see they're actually paired up pretty nicely with the indicatives, then we'll do examples of all of them. I've got one example sentence I'm going to show you with all of them and see how they differ from each other. So the first of the subjunctive conditions then I want to talk about is called the contrary to fact present. Another term for this is called the present contrafactual. And the way this one works is that you have an imperfect subjunctive in the protasis and an imperfect subjunctive in the apodosis. And the way that you translate this is, were this happening, then this would be happening. But it's with the idea that it's not happening. It's contrary to fact. You can do this in the present. You can also do this in the past. But note that even though this first one is a present contrafactual, we're using the imperfect subjunctive. And notice also in English, we use the imperfect for this. If this were happening, then this would be happening. And we know that it's not. Okay? So in order to do contrary to fact past, or also known as a past contrafactual, you have to use the pluperfect subjunctive. And you should think about the sequence of tenses, and you're going to use pluperfect subjunctive in both of these. But think about the sequence of tenses and what the perfect, or I should say the imperfect subjunctive does and the pluperfect subjunctive does. Remember that the imperfect subjunctive gives you contemporaneous action with a past tense verb, a secondary tense verb, whereas the pluperfect subjunctive gives you past action with a past tense verb. So now we've got the pluperfect is showing us contrary to fact in the past. And the way that you would translate that is, had this happened, then this would have happened. Again, contrary to fact past or past contrafactual. The last one, then before we go in and fill these blanks in, because we've got some blank space here on the page, is I want to talk about the future less vivid, which is the subjunctive condition that is attached to the future more vivid. And that's really kind of the only name that this one goes by, is the future less vivid. And the way that this one works, a little bit more possibilities here, is you have a present subjunctive, because remember, present subjunctive is going to be contemporaneous or future action, subsequent action, possibilities here. And then in the apodosis, a present indicative or a present subjunctive. And you're going to translate them a little bit differently. So this could be something like, should this happen? And then depending on which one you're dealing with, present indicative or present subjunctive, it could be this does happen or this would happen. So it just depends. And this is the future less vivid. Now, here's an example. I'm going to do one example then for all of them. The same sentence. We're going to use two verbs, intro and video. And we're going to put a form of intro in the protasis and video in the apodosis. So here's the example in the simple fact present. And again, we begin these clauses with si. Si Petrus domum intrat fratris orantes videt. So we've got our protasis on top, our apodosis on the bottom, our two verbs at the end of the clauses here. If Peter enters the house, then he sees the brothers praying. Okay, very simple fact present. So let's make a modification and take both of the verbs, both indicative verbs, and put them in a past tense. Si Petrus domum, instead of intrat, then we'll do intrabat. And then again, with our apodosis, the praying brothers, videbat. So, if Peter was entering the house, then he was seeing the brothers praying. Or if Peter entered the house, then he saw the brothers praying. Two indicatives translated as indicatives. Let's do the simple fact future, the future more vivid. Same sentence. Si Petrus domum, from intrabat now, will go to intrabit. So that would be, if Peter will enter the house, fratres orantes, praying brothers, vide bit. instead of but. So if Peter enters the house, and then you can say, basically at some point in the future, then he will see the brothers praying. This is assuming that he's, hasn't done it yet, of course, and is not doing it at the moment, but will do it. And it's a certainty. If he does this, then this will happen. This is the future more vivid. Clear. So we got the left-hand side, left column filled out. Let's do the right side. Let's do the subjunctive conditions. So this first one, contrary to fact present, or the present contrafactual, goes with the simple fact present. So we said, instead of having, present indicatives, now we're going to have imperfect subjunctives. Si Petrus domum intraret, right, that imperfect subjunctive, fratres orantes videret. And so we would translate this as, if Peter were entering the house, and we know that he's not, then he would see his brothers praying. But he's not. That's the implication, right? This is a contrary to fact present, or present contrafactual. We know this is not happening. But if the protasis was true, then the apodosis would follow. But it's not. Okay, so it's the opposite of the simple fact present. Let's do the contrary to fact past, or the past contrafactual. Si Petrus domum intravisit, that pluperfect subjunctive, fratris orantes, the praying brothers, vidisset. So, if Peter had entered the house, and we know that he didn't, then he would have seen the brothers praying. Contrary to fact, just in the past. Okay, the last one I want to do, and then we'll be finished, is an example of the future less vivid. The difference between the future more vivid and the future less vivid is we're going from indicatives now to subjunctives, and we're going into the present subjunctive because that's the one that's going to show us either contemporaneous action or subsequent action. So, si Petrus domum intret fratres orantes videat. So we've got our verbs here. I should underline all of these, I suppose. See the differences. If Peter should enter the house, then he does see, or even would see, the brothers praying. Notice the difference between the simple fact present and the simple fact past, and the contrary to fact present, the contrary to fact past, and then the futures, how different they are. So you can't really have a contrary to fact future. You just have a future less vivid because you don't know how it's going to work out. Again, these kind of go together. You want to study those. You want to learn those. And again, Latin likes to operate with clauses. So oftentimes the clauses are greater than the sum of their parts. So remember to do the reading, do the exercises, and we'll come back and talk about this the next class. All right, we'll see you then.